The divorce papers arrived after almost 39 years of marriage. Think about that for a second. The public knew the song, the smiles, the sailor hat, the soft television glow, but behind one of the biggest love songs of the 1970s, the woman at the piano would later say, there was almost no affection at all. They had a #1 record, they had a Grammy, they had a primetime ABC show. They had a song so cheerful that millions heard it as a promise, not a warning. And decades later, the couple who told America love will keep us together proved that sometimes love is not what keeps people together. Sometimes it is work. Sometimes it is image. Sometimes it is silence. The chart numbers are real. The record of the year win is real. The divorce filing is real. And the final scene is real too. After everything, after the memoir, after the split, she was still beside him when he died in Prescott, Arizona, on January 2nd, 2019. This was never just a cute soft rock duo with a novelty smile. It was a story about two musicians who built a fantasy so bright that even they could not live inside it. This is the real story of Captain and Tennille. And by the end, the question is not why the marriage ended. The harder question is why it lasted so long. Chapter 1, Before the Love Song. Before America knew the smiles, before the sailor hat became the image, and before one chorus turned into a national promise, Toni Tennille and Daryl Dragon were simply two serious musicians trying to find steady ground. That matters, because Captain and Tennille are easy to shrink into a soft focus memory. Harmless, cute, safe, maybe even too sweet. But that is not where their story starts. Toni Tennille was born Catherine Antoinette Tennille in Montgomery, Alabama, on May 8, 1940. She studied at Auburn University, and long before she became the voice on one of the biggest pop records of the decade, she was already writing and performing. Her path west took her to Southern California, where she co-wrote a rock musical called Mother Earth with Ron Thronson. The musical did not make her famous, but it put her in the right room. Playing keyboards in the house band was Daryl Dragon. Daryl was born in Los Angeles, California, on August 27, 1942, into a family where music was not a hobby. It was the family business. His father, Carmen Dragon, was a conductor, composer, and arranger, which meant Daryl grew up close to the discipline behind polished music. He was not a random man who drifted into pop with a hat and a gimmick. He could play. He knew arrangements. He understood how a clean record was built. Toni had her own kind of power. Her voice carried brightness without strain, the kind of sound that made people relax before they realized they were listening closely. From the start, they were not selling danger. They were not selling rebellion. Their music leaned toward warmth, melody, neatness, and comfort, which made it easy for people to mistake them for something simple. But clean does not mean simple. When Toni and Daryl met through Mother Earth, they were not yet a brand. The sailor hat had not swallowed his identity. Her voice had not been tied forever to one famous promise. Nobody knew that Love Will Keep Us Together would one day make them sound like America's happiest married couple. At that point, they were just trying to make music work, and the first machine that pulled them closer to fame belonged to the Beach Boys. Chapter 2, The Beach Boys Connection. To understand where Captain and Tennille really came from, you have to begin beside another band's spotlight. Daryl Dragon played keyboards for the Beach Boys from 1967 to 1972. That was not some minor footnote. The Beach Boys were already one of the most recognizable American groups in pop history, and Daryl was close enough to watch music, image, and personality turn into something larger than the people inside it. That is also where the Captain was born. According to the story, Mike Love gave Daryl the nickname because he wore a captain's hat on stage. It was simple, almost silly in its innocence, but it stuck so firmly that it became half of his public name. Once a nickname like that gets printed on records and television screens, it stops being just a joke. It becomes a costume you have to keep wearing. Toni entered that world through Daryl. After he recommended her, she joined the Beach Boys on tour as an additional keyboard player. Before millions watched her smile beside him, she had already stood inside one of the most famous touring operations in American pop. She saw the pressure, the polish, and the way fans responded to familiar faces, familiar sounds, and an image held carefully in place. That experience mattered. It meant Toni and Daryl were not naive when their own chance came. They understood that a song alone was not always enough. A record needed a story. A performance needed a look. A duo needed a shape people could remember after one glance. And they had one. He was the quiet keyboard man in the captain's hat. She was the warm singer at the piano. Together, they looked less like a rock act and more like the couple next door who somehow ended up with perfect pitch. That image would make them famous. It would also trap them. When the world decides you are wholesome, cheerful, romantic, and safe, it leaves very little room for anything messy underneath. But before that problem could catch up with them, Toni and Daryl had to get anyone to care. So instead of waiting for a record company to discover them, they recorded The Way I Want to Touch You.
The way that I wanna love you.
Pressed copies and sent them around Los Angeles. Not some massive campaign, just two musicians, a private label, and a box of records trying to become a future. Chapter 3: 500 Records and One Impossible Break. The first real break did not arrive like a fairy tale. No giant label rushed in on day one. No army of promoters stood ready. No national machine was waiting to turn Captain and Tennille into household names. At first, there were records. 500 copies of The Way I Want to Touch You.
I never wanted to live with a man.
Sent to favorite Los Angeles disc jockeys. That number matters because it tells you who they were before the public image hardened. They were not yet the couple with the primetime show. They were not yet Grammy winners. They were still hustling, trying to get one song into the right hands. Somehow it worked. The single moved locally on the Joyce label before A&M Records stepped in. The story goes that promoter Jan Basham brought the record to Kip Cohen, A&M's vice president of artists and repertoire. A&M bought the single, reissued it, and signed the duo. That was the first door opening. But the song that changed everything was still waiting. Love Will Keep Us Together was not written by Toni or Daryl. It came from Neil Sedaka and Howard Greenfield. Toni and Daryl heard Sedaka sing it, then heard it again in Kip Cohen's office. Some songs take time to reveal themselves. This one must have sounded like it already knew where it was going. They recorded Love Will Keep Us Together on January 25, 1975. Along with God Only Knows. On the finished record, Hal Blaine played drums, while Daryl's keyboards and arrangement sense gave the track its bright, tight engine. That is the part people miss. The song became famous for Toni's voice and the couple's image, but underneath the cheer was serious craft. The record does not wander, it snaps into place. The rhythm is clean, the hook is immediate. Toni sings it with a grin in her voice, but the production moves with almost ruthless efficiency. Then came the irony. A song called Love Will Keep Us Together became the record that turned a real marriage into a public promise. The title became a label. The chorus became a brand. The world did not just hear a catchy pop song, it looked at Toni and Daryl and decided it was seeing proof. Proof that love could be cheerful. Proof that marriage could be simple. Proof that two people could smile through the whole performance and mean every word. That is what made the record so powerful. It is also what made the later truth so painful. Once Love Will Keep Us Together started climbing, it took over. It opened the door to an album, bigger singles, television, awards, and a public identity that looked almost impossible to damage. But here is the strange thing about a perfect image. The brighter it gets, the harder it is to admit when something inside it has gone dark. Chapter 4: America Buys the Fantasy. When Love Will Keep Us Together hit, it did more than make Captain and Tennille famous. It made them feel inevitable. The single reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1975, stayed there for 4 weeks, and became Billboard's top single of the year. Their debut album, also called Love Will Keep Us Together, climbed to #2 on the Billboard 200. Then came the cleanest industry stamp possible, Record of the Year at the Grammy Awards. That is a lot to happen from one song, and it happened fast. One minute, Toni and Daryl were sending out records themselves. The next, America was treating them like the couple who had cracked some secret code of happiness. The sailor hat was no longer just a hat. Toni's smile was no longer just a smile. Together, they looked like the safest room in popular music. People wanted that in the middle of the 1970s. Rock had its wreckage. Disco was taking over dance floors. Singer-songwriters were digging into heartbreak. Captain and Tennille offered something lighter. Their music gave listeners melody, polish, and the feeling that everything could still turn out sweet. That sweetness became their empire. The Way I Want to Touch You came back through A&M Records and reached number 4 on the pop chart.
Live with you. You are sunshine.
On adult contemporary radio, their grip was even stronger. Their first 5 titles on that chart all reached number 1. Love Will Keep Us Together, The Way I Want to Touch You, Lonely Night Angel Face, Shop Around, and Muskrat Love.
All I have is teardrops through a lonely night. On bacon, chewing on cheese. Sam says
That last one became its own kind of legend. Muskrat Love was strange, soft, and almost impossible to defend if you were trying to look cool. But that was part of the point. Captain and Tennille were not chasing danger. They leaned into pop innocence, the kind that made critics roll their eyes and made ordinary listeners keep buying the records. Their second album, Song of Joy, came out in 1976 and reached number 9 on the Billboard 200. It gave them more hits, more visibility, and proof that the first smash had not been a fluke. That same year, they hosted a primetime ABC television series, pushing the image even deeper into American living rooms. Now, the fantasy had a weekly address. Television let viewers watch the marriage, or at least the version of the marriage that could survive lighting, costumes, jokes, songs, and a network time slot. Daryl was the quiet one under the hat. Toni was the open, bright center. He looked shy, she looked warm. Together, they looked harmless. But harmless can be a trap. Once audiences believe they know who you are, they punish you for changing. Captain and Tennille were no longer just musicians. They were a promise with faces. Their records could not simply be records. Their marriage could not simply be private. Every song about love seemed to confirm the brand. And that is where the trouble hides. A song can be polished until it shines. A television image can be rehearsed until it feels real. But a marriage has to survive after the camera cuts. Chapter 5. The smile starts to crack. Success did not disappear all at once. For a while, Captain and Tennille still looked secure. Come In From the Rain reached number 18 on the Billboard 200 in 1977.
open door for you to come in from the rain.
And their audience had not vanished. They were still recognizable, still bankable, still tied to a sound that radio understood. But the center was changing. The late 1970s were not gentle to acts built around soft certainty. Disco had exploded. Rock was getting louder. Punk had arrived to sneer at polish. New wave was waiting at the door. In that world, the clean smiles of Captain and Tennille began to look less like comfort and more like yesterday's room. Their album Dream arrived in 1978 and peaked at number 131. That was a warning flare. The duo, who had once seemed untouchable, was learning how quickly pop can decide that a sound has had its moment. Still, Toni and Daryl were not finished. In 1979, they moved to Casablanca Records and released Make Your Move. The album reached number 23, and from it came one more huge single,
Do Mr. One and Only, to sweep you off.
Do That to Me One More Time. In 1980, the song went to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100. That should have been a victory lap. In one sense, it was. Plenty of acts never get one number 1 record. Captain and Tennille had 2. They had crossed into a new decade and still landed at the top. Toni's voice could still carry a song. Daryl's instincts still knew how to build a soft pop machine that worked. But Do That to Me One More Time did not reset the story. It did not make them feel new again.
While I got you near, oh.
It felt like one last bright flare from a duo whose identity had become too fixed. The world knew what Captain and Tennille were supposed to be, and that was the problem. They could win, but they could not easily surprise anyone. The brand had become a cage. Their best records were crafted, efficient, and built with real musicianship. Toni was not just a smiling frontwoman. Daryl was not just a man in a hat. But pop can be cruel to people who make happiness look easy. When the songs are cheerful, the work behind them disappears. When the image is cute, the musicianship gets mocked. When the marriage is part of the marketing, nobody wants to imagine the two people inside it going home to silence. And silence is where this story turns. Years later, the public would learn that the brightest part of the act may have been the hardest thing for Toni Tennille to live with. The songs kept saying love, the television show kept selling warmth. The old records kept smiling from the shelf. But according to Toni, affection was the thing missing at home. That is the wound. Not that Captain and Tennille stopped having hits. Not that the industry moved on. The real wound is that their greatest song became a sentence they had to live under for the rest of their lives. Love will keep us together. Every word got heavier with time. Chapter 6. What Love Did Not Fix. On January 16, 2014, Toni Tennille filed for divorce in Arizona. She and Daryl Dragon had been married for almost 39 years. For fans, the headline felt almost unreal. People divorce every day, but this was different because of the name attached to it. This was the couple from Love Will Keep Us Together, the couple from the smiling television clips, the couple whose public identity had been built around soft affection, musical partnership, and domestic pop fantasy. Then the papers arrived. Daryl later said he did not know about the filing until he was served. That detail strips away the television glow. No duet, no stage banter, no neat ending. Just legal papers. After decades of a life the public thought it understood. Toni would later explain the divorce in painful terms. She said the marriage lacked affection and described Daryl as unable to give the emotional closeness she needed. That has to be said carefully. This was her account. It should not become a cheap villain story because real marriages are rarely that clean. But it does change how the old songs sound. The Way I Want to Touch You becomes more than an early hit title. Love Will Keep Us Together becomes more than a chorus. Even Do That to Me One More Time, their last #1, starts to carry a strange echo. The titles seem romantic on paper, but beside Toni's later account, they feel almost cruel in hindsight. Daryl's late years were also marked by health problems. Toni wrote publicly in 2010 about his neurological condition and severe tremors, which made it difficult or impossible for him to play keyboards. For a musician like Daryl, that struck at the part of him the public rarely understood best. The hat was famous. The quiet face was famous. But the hands mattered. Those hands had played keyboards for the Beach Boys. Those hands helped build the records that made Captain and Tennille sound so clean and bright. When tremors interfered with that, the loss was not only physical, it was musical. The divorce was finalized in July 2014. Then came Toni's memoir, and more public discussion of what the marriage had really felt like to her. By then, the old image was impossible to see the same way. The bright pop couple had become something more complicated and more human. And still, the ending was not hate. When Daryl Dragon died on January 2, 2019, he was 76 years old. He died from renal failure at a hospice in Prescott, Arizona. Toni was by his side. After the divorce, after the memoir, after the private pain became public, she was still there. That final scene does not erase what came before. It does not prove the marriage was secretly perfect. It does not turn loneliness into romance or illness into closure. But it does show that the bond between Toni and Daryl was never simple enough to fit inside a hit song, a television image, or a divorce headline. Maybe that is the real story of Captain and Tennille. Not that love kept them together forever. Not that the promise was true in the way fans wanted it to be. But that two people can build something beautiful, fail each other in painful ways, leave the marriage, and still carry enough history to sit together at the end. The song made it sound easy. Their life proved it never was. So when people laugh at the sailor hat or reduce Captain and Tennille to one bright chorus from the 1970s, they miss the harder story underneath. This was not just a soft pop act with a cute image. It was two serious musicians who found the exact sound America wanted, then became trapped inside the promise that sound created. Love Will Keep Us Together gave them everything. The hit, the Grammy, the television glow, the place in pop history. But life asked for more than a chorus could give. And maybe that is why the ending stays with you. Not because love fixed everything. It did not. But because after the fame, the silence, the divorce, and the pain, Toni Tennille was still there beside Daryl Dragon when the song finally ended.